My name is James Simpson. I'm the chair of the English department. Skip was unable to make it this evening, so he's asked me to introduce David Bromwich, and I'm very honoured to do so. I come to David Bromwich's immensely accomplished scholarship via my interest in Edmund Burke. Now, I realise this is not David's topic this evening, so I've decided not to introduce him by focusing on the fact that the American left inherits two heterogeneous traditions, one reformist, the other revolutionary. The reformist tradition seeks to limit centralised power, and it respects the past. The revolutionary tradition must, by contrast, deploy centralised power. It regards the past as a catastrophe whose burdens we need to throw off. The reformist tradition prizes the literature of the past. The instinct of the revolutionary tradition is, again by contrast, iconoclastic, in keeping with its persuasion that the past is only a criminal shackle. I'm not, as I say, going to develop this theme, nor will I point to the fact that Edmund Burke is the indispensable figure in understanding how these traditions interrelate, how they come to us historically. Burke looks back to the glorious revolution of 1688. He makes decisive interventions in the revolutions of 1776 and 1789. He's most famous, of course, for his anti-revolutionary stance in response to 1789, but that opposition can only be understood in the larger pattern of his approval for the constitutional revolutions of 1688 and 1776, which, in my view, perhaps contentiously, were not happily true revolutions. Burke's points of reference are those of David Bromwich. Both traverse European and American modernity from the 17th century to their own times. And Burke is the thread that runs throughout David Bromwich's scholarly career, from a collection of studies of self and community from Edmund Burke to Robert Frost, entitled A Choice of Inheritance of 1989, to his edition of a selection of Burke's political writings on empire, liberty and reform of 2000, to volume 1 of an intellectual biography of Burke, from the sublime and beautiful to American Independence, published in 2014. And we're all looking forward to the second volume of that biography. Now, as I say, this is not David's topic this evening. I won't be talking about it. Instead, Professor Bromwich turns to new material, to another brave and brilliant reflector on the agonies of American modernity, for whom representation, which is a term, after all, both artistic and political, for whom representation is central, W.E.B. Du Bois. The title of David's talk is Du Bois, Representation and Dissent. Please join me in welcoming David Bromwich.
Thank you. I'd be glad to talk about Burke, who is only a little less voluminous, encyclopedic, and hard to handle a writer than I have found Du Bois to be. So let me start on that note by saying that W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the most complicated Americans who ever lived. His autobiographical books and essays make this word complicated only the first that's apt to occur to a fascinated reader. But there are other possibilities close behind. Intelligent, ambitious, erudite, reserved, selfless and at the same time self-regarding, courageous, haughty. And it's a thought that occurs only gradually some way into one's encounter with the man. Maybe the final adjective should be strange. An illustration of this strangeness might begin with Du Bois' confession in the chapter of the posthumous autobiography published in 1968 called My Character, that at the time when he, quote, went south to Fisk at the age of 17, and this is Du Bois, I actually did not know the physical difference between men and women. This extreme peculiarity can't be ascribed to his race. Such a gap in the early knowledge of a man of irrepressible inquisitiveness may be traced in a degree to his puritanical upbringing, and we might guess it was partly self-imposed and abetted by the energies he dedicated even as a child to ideal and intellectual pursuits. But when Du Bois tells the reader soon after that as a teacher in the rural districts of East Tennessee, quote, I was literally raped by the unhappy wife who was my landlady, and that when he, quote, returned home to teach, I was literally frightened into marriage, the peculiarity looks like character, not accident. Du Bois's other statements in this late self-portrait about the all-importance of women in his life are of an unusual frankness, though they leave the mystery untouched, and I have no interest in dwelling on sex as any sort of key to his life or thought or character. It seems fair to take it as an incitement to look closely at Du Bois's explorations of his great subject, which I take to be estrangement, the arbitrary distance, whether enforced by law or social convention, between people of different sorts, a distance that makes for misery rather than satisfaction, the color line being the most inescapable instance of that estrangement. I call it this, estrangement, rather than, say, alienation, because the latter word and idea suggest a permanent and at some point a willed defection by the self from society. Estrangement, in comparison, can be only partial, and it can be productive. One sees the familiar predicament in a long perspective when one has lived habitually inside it, yet can somehow know it from a distance too. And this is part of what Du Bois had in mind when, in the first pages of the first chapter of The Souls of Black Folk, of our spiritual strivings, he propounded his doctrine of the double consciousness. The Negro is, quote, born with a veil, he writes, it's a famous passage, but I will read it, and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on it in amused contempt and pity. One feels ever this two-ness. An American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. Soon after, in the same extended passage, Du Bois will speak of this unchosen burden of special knowledge as a cause of continuous struggle. Ordinary experience is loaded with exhausting psychological toils because of this doubleness, and even in the sentences I just quoted, the condition is said to involve a deprivation of any true consciousness. And yet, a double consciousness sounds richer, wider, and possibly more to be desired than a single consciousness. And the passage in The Souls of Black Folk is in fact ambiguous on this point. It says the Negro is fated to see himself only, that's the word, through the eyes of the white world, but the double consciousness is also a gift, again, Du Bois's words, something like second sight. And here the complexity deepens, for the idea of second sight was routinely applied in the 19th century to illusory or phantasmal images in the mind, but also to visions brought to the seer by an extraordinary and uncanny perceptiveness, a faculty that sets him apart from his fellows. So one of the things given, it seems, to the double consciousness may be an everyday and as if clairvoyant knowledge that society itself in any possible form is a veil, is an artifice. Society on any terms is an intricate mechanism, yes, a marvel created by human nature, but one that casts us out of nature. Society is a sham, a cell, an infernal machine, or at least a rigged game with irretrievable consequences, full of accommodations based on a false necessity in which people are half coerced, half persuaded to accept their present condition as the necessary condition of life. A fact never to be overlooked, I think, concerning Du Bois, who had studied with Max Weber as well as with William James, is that he belonged to the first great generation of American sociologists. These new scientists looked on their discipline with pride as a bringer of systematic inquiry that could lead to social reform and amelioration. Du Bois shared that optimistic outlook. It never altogether left him. And double consciousness might also describe the skill and tact a sociology must work to acquire. It's given to the black person. The sociologist works to acquire it, but there's some kinship thereby between them. Anyway, it's given, he says, to every black man and woman with an overbalance of pain, so that a gift that might serve enlightenment can seldom do anything but drag one down. Some commentators have associated this double consciousness with the idea of a self as an unending experiment that one finds in the writings of Walt Whitman. I think the connection between these two thinkers is intimate, and that Du Bois's full intentions regarding the double consciousness show most clearly in juxtaposition with certain passages of Song of Myself. Whitman divides the ordinary self of experience from something less reachable, which he calls the soul, and then surprises the reader by asserting that the two are equally precious, somehow perhaps even holy. I believe in you, my soul. The other I am must not abase itself to you, and you must not be abased to the other. It is noble then, I'm paraphrasing what I take Whitman to imply here, it is noble then to give unashamed value to the phenomena of the life you live and the other lives you encounter. It would be abase oneself, to set one above the other. This maxim, passed on, I believe, from Whitman to Du Bois, implies a permanent irony in one's understanding of experience. And irony is taken here not as a sort of stance, a posture, a knowingness, an attitude to be struck at opportune moments, but rather an ethic, a way of life, and the only way really compatible with self-knowledge and with charity toward others. It has its own code of self-estimation and self-sufficiency and authenticity, an authenticity answerable to the inward self, but not therefore contemptuous of the socialized outward self. It sets a standard of integrity as high as that of the most rigorous New England Puritan of the first generation, but it does so without Puritan asceticism. What would it be to live by this maxim? The other I am must not be abased to you, and you must not be abased to the other. To live that is in possession of what Du Bois came to call the double consciousness. Again, I think we find a possible answer in Song of Myself, in a formulation which looks forward to the candor of the surprising disclosures of self-doubt, always free of self-denunciation, which permeate the autobiographical writings of Du Bois. And these are a second set of lines from Song of Myself. Apart from the pulling and hauling stands what I am, stands amused, complacent, compassionating, idle, unitary. Looks down, is erect, or bends an arm on an impalpable certain rest, looking with side-curved head, curious what will come next, both in and out of the game, and watching and wondering at it. Whitman here gives the clue to an almost chemical strangeness in the combined postures of commitment and detachment that one finds in Du Bois' Dusk of Dawn, the book that he subtitled presumptuously and modestly, an autobiography of a race concept. One can think about that phrase a lot and not come to the end of it. That is to say, a person saying about his own life that in writing it, he is writing not just the autobiography of an idea, but the autobiography of not a race either, but of a race concept. But nothing in Whitman's sketch will cover the difference that's made by the intervention of the veil, a barrier commonly physical between black and white society that renders the estrangement Du Bois must speak of incomparably perverse in its effects on thought and feeling. In this sense, the double consciousness is not in this sense, the double consciousness is a given, not a chosen endowment of the individual. It is an ascriptive trait by its very commonness, which tends to de-individuate. And it compels the emotions of curiosity, wonder, amusement, and compassion into a narrow channel that's seldom quite free of needless apprehensiveness. Consider for just one example, compassion. And for convenience, let's make compassion synonymous with the Christian sense of pity. Consider how different is the pity regarding the color line as felt by a white man who dislikes and passively consents to the separation, and the experience of a black man who deplores the predicament, but to the extent that he would live a life not committed to rebellion, has no choice but to accept it. The burden in the latter case is, to use the word again, incomparably greater. But to live in such a world with poise and aplomb, and with resistance where resistance is useful and necessary, this describes a modern state of mind potentially superior to that of the unquestioning inmate of the civil condition, superior in point of resourcefulness, adaptability, self-trust, and a quickness of both thought and responsive feeling. Du Bois plainly saw this, and it's an impression he conveys vividly in his other writings. It was because he saw it, I believe, that he chose the partly honorific word consciousness, which comes out of William James, too. But the contingent advantage that almost never becomes a privilege this contingent advantage almost never becomes a privilege in lived experience. The color line at arbitrary moments is fated to be much more definite than anyone expected. The most vivid testimony of that truth from Du Bois himself comes in the chapter of Dusk of Dawn called Revolution, where reviewing the works and the public and private encounters of his first 3 decades in academic life and active politics, he remarks with bewilderment how little time a black man, even of acknowledged merit like himself, has been given to spend in common social intercourse with white people of his class. He seems able to number the occasions over 30 years on the fingers of 2 hands. The stages of Du Bois's thinking are marked in every case, it seems to me, by a public contest with a prominent antagonist, sometimes a person, sometimes an institution. Booker T. Washington was a predecessor he admired within honesty and criticized without rancor, but Du Bois' own refusal to accept society as a given, as well as his intellectual optimism, disposed him to reject very firmly Washington's ideology of self-help, itself a Victorian product, I think, coming out of Samuel Smiles and other sources. Racism and the color line were by this expedient, Washington's that is, to be treated almost as a physical law of the social universe, and the province of black labor was to be limited by the availability of employment in the trades, crafts, and services. Du Bois knew by introspection and by his exposure to professional men of more than one color that the apparent realism of Washington's approach was founded in an excess of humility, but also in delusion. His own preference for a broader collective approach would crystallize in his advocacy first of a leadership by the talented tenth in projects for the elevation of black society. Later, with his disappointment in the Republican administrations following the Great War and his recognition of the partial character of the remedies offered by the New Deal, he would promote the economic plan for a Negro cooperative movement, its strength to be achieved on a frankly segregated basis. A similar phase of disenchantment with the liberal consensus of the late 1940s and 1950s would precipitate in his final years a suggestion of pragmatic alliance with the emerging African nations and the embrace of communism as the only remaining path to economic and social equality. And I think to an outside view, this fact of Du Bois' biography, which he talks about so candidly in late essays, is one of the most remarkable, I'd say even facts about American cultural history, that he who had seen the totalitarian drift and the social maladaptation of communism to the American scene, nevertheless, in his late old age, in his late 80s, finally turned communist after having resisted it in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. It's extraordinary. A strategic misstep of Du Bois' middle years, which weighed heavily on him, was the decision to throw all his energies into black participation on the Anglo-American French side of the First World War. His policy here was strategic, to use the word again as he came to see it, in a merely politic sense, and he had misjudged the politics even as he underestimated the horror of war. And those are his words, and I think they deserve tremendous appreciation. Very few people who have gone whole length into the advocacy of a war, think of American advocates of the Iraq War, have had the nerve, the decency, the self-doubt to admit they were wrong, and that the reason they were wrong was that they underestimated the horror of war. Those are Du Bois's words. Du Bois, from an early stage, seems to have harbored the intuition that the origin of violence itself was in war, and the origins of all war were in race war. This is a thesis that's advanced by Foucault in the lectures recently published from his 80s career in the Collège de France under the title "Society Must Be Defended." I doubt if Foucault knew that Du Bois had said it so long before him, or perhaps even much about who Du Bois was. His analysis grew subtler at the point where national wars were looked on by analogy with race war, and not as the necessary offspring of race war. Thus, in a speculation I've not found elsewhere, Du Bois noticed that the rise of Jim Crow regulations and the legitimation of lynching in the South in the decades roughly 1880 to 1930, at its inception, that is to say the 80s, the 90s, and the years preceding the First World War, at its inception coincided with the surge of European imperialist exploits that are commonly described as the scramble for Africa. You look at this passage and you're suddenly looking at that period with open eyes that other Americans haven't had. This made the anti-Negro violence of the United States so strong in that period, part of a larger action of violent subordination imposed by the prospering classes of the North against the subject peoples of the South worldwide. The atrocious conduct of the U.S. in the Philippines could plausibly be understood in this light. But even as he was arriving at his analysis after the First World War, Du Bois did not relinquish his hope for advances by black people through education. And that's his theme throughout, education. But education is seen now as a longer process and more intricate than the acquisition of knowledge of the arts and sciences. There are habits of mind that take generations to learn or to unlearn. His aim of using the sacrifice of black soldiers in the First World War to gain leverage for economic equality at home had its background, of course, in the Civil War. Lincoln and Frederick Douglass alike had supposed that the presence, the visible sacrifice of black soldiers in the Union Army were the necessary means for converting a sectional war into an abolition war. Having demonstrated loyalty by this supreme test, black soldiers coming home deserved a kind of appreciation that would turn a new chapter in American race relations. Du Bois had not expected that, as he would later put it, white officers on the front in the First World War would expend more energy fighting the black American soldiers than they spent fighting the Germans. The quality of war was only to heat the emotions appropriate to war. How could Du Bois have gotten this wrong? He was playing a role derived from that of Douglass, but Woodrow Wilson was not Lincoln. And yet the misjudgment had an understandable basis in the common sense of group psychology. A special status is always granted to the soldier. Gandhi took a similar attitude toward Indian participation in the First World War. It's an aspect of Gandhi's thought, his early thought in the days of the South African agitations and early on in India, that's sometimes forgotten. Gandhi presented himself as a loyal participant in the British Empire. He used the word empire almost as freely, almost as embracingly as Churchill would do. So Gandhi took a similar attitude. The reformer must prove himself and sharpen himself as a warrior first, or as scholar Gandhi Uday Mehta has described this view, the chivalric soldier of nonviolence is a character in the world even more courageous than the ordinary soldier who marches up to the mouth of a cannon, because he, the nonviolent one, takes his risk unarmed. Du Bois, however, who was never more than a tactical advocate of nonviolence, was working from a utilitarian psychology. The victor would measure the good performed by black soldiers and deliver some proportionate good in return. By the time he wrote The Souls of White Folk, the essay of that title, in 1920, Du Bois could show that he knew better. Quote, and this is just one of many instances that might be cited of his capacity for self-criticism. It's everywhere. And sometimes he says, I'm going against what I earlier thought. I was wrong. Sometimes he doesn't say it, but it's there for us anyway, and quite unusual. Quote, this is 1920, 2 years after the end of the war. The cause of war is preparation for war. And of all that Europe has done in a century, there is nothing that has equaled in energy, thought, and time her preparation for wholesale murder. Time itself, time the redeemer and intercessor, as Shelley calls it in The Defense of Poetry, plays a large role in the thinking of Du Bois, as it did in Shelley's, and I suspect he had read Shelley with intense sympathy. Time was lost in the war that could not be recovered. And Du Bois' miscalculation had followed naturally enough from the collective frame for imagining reform that was supplied by the administrative concerns of sociology. You study a problem, I'm actually paraphrasing here what an eminent Harvard political theorist some 35 years ago told to one of his PhD students at her oral exam. You study a problem, you analyze the actors and the contingent and inseparable condition, and you implement a solution. You implement a solution. For this, you need the state. And like the radicals and liberals of his generation, or I should say generations, given the 90 years of his life, Du Bois asked much from the state. He was never for that reason deficient in skepticism, and his eventual support of Soviet Russia was declared in spite of his skepticism, something that comes out in his early exchange with Claude McKay in the pages of The Crisis. The communist view, he tells McKay, that economic equality is the all-important source of race prejudice. This is just false. I had thought it would be interesting to supply each of the three authors in this series of lectures with an interlocutor who was not black, but who wrote in a manner answerable to the same spirit of inquiry. With Frederick Douglass, that task was not hard, and with Ellison too, I hope to show tomorrow, such a comparison is plausible and almost immediately rewarding. Du Bois's range is great and his achievement extraordinary, and this makes for a challenge. He spread himself across the genres of economic history, sociology, anthropology, and pamphleteering journalism, where in the length of that career, from the early 1890s to the early 1960s, shall we find a conversation partner who seems to touch his essential note for long enough. I think such a person, I've decided reluctantly, hence falsifying the whole project of this series of lectures, such a person simply does not exist, not among his white contemporaries. If you measure the length of a career that has Josiah Royce at one end and Kwame Nkrumah at the other, but not either among the black dissidents, where the span runs from Booker T. Washington to Martin Luther King. But the First World War seems to me, to say it again, a turning point. And the best counterstatement to Du Bois from a writer sympathetic to his radicalism may come from Randolph Bourne, a libertarian believer in a transnational America, by which he meant what we would now translate as, I suppose, multicultural America, and an opponent of state power. There's the difference. Hostility to the state, such as one finds in the writings of Bourne, was a position that could never seem quite real to Du Bois, given the origins of sociology itself and study of society and the state as essentially related and indispensable to one another, and given, one ought to add, his own hopes for reform expressed as early as his success at very nearly extorting from ex-President Hayes the scholarship that sent him to study at Oxford, and given his hopeful efforts to find support for widening the franchise of black people from Presidents Wilson, Harding, and Coolidge in succession. Disappointment in Calvin Coolidge is really one of the odd notes in Du Bois, and one finds it, I think, in no other writer of comparable intelligence. Writing in Dusk of Dawn in 1940 of his own motives for leading a collective effort of patriotic support for the First World War, an effort Du Bois, from a distance of 2 decades, is inclined to suspect was wrong. He quoted from his own work the embarrassing, trite, and rousing calls to arms that he'd addressed to potential black recruits. And yet he also recalled there the false confidence that had been yielded by his scholarship. Quote, "Through my knowledge of Germany, I wished to see her defeated, and for that reason, when America entered the war, I believed we would in reality fight for democracy, including colored folk, and not merely for war investments." Here he speaks overtly of his intention of using service in the armed forces to gain leverage for integration and equal treatment of blacks, and the passage continues, quote, "I felt for a moment during the war that I could be without reservation a patriotic American. At other times, I was bowed down and sickened by the public burnings, the treatment of colored troops, and the widespread mob law." So it would seem from the violence of war might emerge gratitude toward all our warriors and diminished violence at home. Part of Du Bois, even then, must have known better. Now, Randolph Bourne, in his essay, The War and the Intellectuals, largely an attack on the so-called realists at the New Republic, including Walter Lippmann and including the largest figure in that group who eventually supported the war, John Dewey, Randolph Bourne had taken a very different stand. Quote, and this is an essay published in the avant-garde magazine Seven Arts in June 1917. "We go to war now to internationalize the world," this is a sarcastic exclamation mark. "But the idea for a League of Nations," says Bourne, "is not a rational program so much as a glowing symbol for the purpose of focusing belief, of setting enthusiasm on fire for international order. As far as it does this, it has pragmatic value, but as far as it, and pragmatic is not a praise word in the vocabulary of Bourne, but as far as it provides a certain mirage of idealism for this war and for a world order founded on mutual fear, it is dangerous and obnoxious. Idealism should be kept for what is ideal." It is depressing to think that the prospect of a world order so strong that none dare challenge it should be the immediate ideal of the American intellectual. Shall I read that sentence again? I think I'll just let it sit. Bourne recognized further that the program of such a league contained no provision for dynamic national growth or for international economic justice, his words. And he would contest the supporters of the war, whom he divided into patriots and realists, by this unforgiving challenge in a sequel entitled A War Diary, published in the same magazine, which begins with this sentence: "The war or American promise, one must choose." The passages of questioning I've cited just now ought to be read as a prelude to the full-scale protest Bourne would finally urge in his essay, The State, unfinished at the time of his death in December 1918. This passage will be known to many of you, but I had not reread it in some time, and I will reread it out loud now. War is the health of the state. It automatically sets in motion throughout society those irresistible forces for uniformity, for passionate cooperation with the government in coercing into obedience the minority groups and individuals which lack the larger herd sense. He's been reading the same people that, and he's much less learned, much less erudite than Du Bois. But Bourne has been reading the same people Du Bois had been reading. William James, Dewey, Nietzsche, and Max Weber, but drawing this different conclusion. The machinery of government sets and enforces the drastic penalties. The minorities are either intimidated into silence or brought slowly around by a subtle process of persuasion, which may seem to them really to be converting them. Of course, the ideal of perfect loyalty, perfect uniformity is never really attained. The classes upon whom the amateur work of coercion falls are unwearied in their zeal, but often their agitation, instead of converting, merely serves to stiffen resistance. Minorities are rendered sullen and some intellectual opinion bitter and satirical, but in general, the nation in wartime attains a uniformity of feeling, a hierarchy of values culminating at the undisputed apex of the state ideal, which could not possibly be produced through any other agency than war. Loyalty or mystic devotion to the state becomes the major imagined human value. Other values, such as artistic creation, knowledge, reason, beauty, the enhancement of life, are instantly and almost unanimously sacrificed, and the significant classes who have constituted themselves the amateur agents of the state are engaged not only in sacrificing these values for themselves, but in coercing all other persons into sacrificing them. The terms of this criticism are severe, but in detail, Bourne's working out of the causes and consequences of the war spirit seems to me unanswerable, and especially so for a social critic who espoused commitments like those of W.E.B. Du Bois. Indeed, the values whose destruction Bourne puts down to the prevalence of the war spirit, artistic creation, knowledge, reason, beauty, the enhancement of life, are the very things Du Bois had undertaken to speak for and defend from the first pages of The Souls of Black Folk. How could a scholarly intellect so free of illusion have been seduced by the mystique of the nation at this critical moment? Some of the causes I would trace to the contradictory qualities of Du Bois always as a social thinker, in fact, even from the variety of genres in which he worked. This was not a matter of surrounding his subject from multiple sides to raise the odds of success. The different genres all seemed to belong to him by elective affinity. It might seem fair, in fact, to speak of different idioms or voices in his writing. His sociological rigor and poetic eye and ear come to be known in styles that necessarily lead to different genres and produce insights at variance with one another. Begin with a passage to illustrate this point from Dusk of Dawn, which typifies one sort of writing, this autobiography of a race concept, feels duty-bound to supply. And this is out of context, but I think it does the work of exhibiting one aspect of Du Bois' academic style. The question now comes as to how far this method of acculturation, introducing higher educational culture to black folk partly through a mixing of the educated and less educated among them, how far this method of acculturation should and could go, and by what conscious planning the uplift of the Negro race can be accomplished through this means. Is cultural separation in the same territory feasible? To force a group of various levels of culture to segregate itself will certainly retard its advance, though he seems to be weighing that possibility, since it must put energy not simply into social advance, but in the vast and intricate effort to duplicate, evolve, and contrive new social institutions to maintain their advance and guard against retrogression. If that was a little harder to listen to than earlier passage I quoted from Du Bois, it's because it's so academic. The presentation there is clear, it is unpretentious as it means to be, but he adopts, both in the passage I read and countless similar ones, the idiom of a managerial elite. The undesignated agency being addressed on a point of feasibility is a well-organized bureaucracy. It's this hidden agency that gives authority to the abstractness of the writing and can speak of the possibility of forcing a group to adopt an artificial plan to promote its own development. Compare now a passage from a chapter of The Souls of Black Folk on the meaning of progress that concerns his experience of teaching in Tennessee. And you'll immediately hear how different it is. It hardly would seem the same writer in anyone less capacious than Du Bois. I loved my school, and the fine faith the children had in the wisdom of their teacher was truly marvelous. We read and spelled together, wrote a little, picked flowers, sang, and listened to stories of the world beyond the hill. At times, the school would dwindle away, and I would start out. I would visit Mun Eddings, who lived in 2 very dirty rooms, and ask why little Lou Jean, whose flaming face seemed ever ablaze with the dark red hair uncombed, was absent all last week, or why I missed so often the inimitable rags of Mac and Ed. Then the father, who worked Colonel Webster's farm on shares, would tell me how the crops needed the boys, and the thin, slovenly mother, whose face was pretty when washed, assured me that Lou Jean must mind the baby. But we'll start them again next week. When the Lawrences stopped, I knew the doubts of the old folks about book learning had conquered again, and so, toiling up the hill and getting as far into the cabin as possible, I put Cicero pro archia poeta into the simplest English with local applications, and usually convinced them for a week or so. Here, both the hope and the almost regular, assured frustration of his idealism as a young teacher are brought close by a narrative of the conditions that thwart every effort of education. Sociology might give a name to the ruling group that made this happen, or to the subordinate group constituted by these rural families who are so curious for education but so ultimately resistant. But the personal names and the obvious affection shown to the people by Du Bois make a difference to how the passage can be read by us. Double consciousness here produces an irony in which the human warmth makes for an element. He's driven, after all, not by duty alone. Finally, consider the voice of historical analysis that's common in Du Bois's range of writings. Again, now from The Souls of Black Folk, the chapter of the Dawn of Freedom. At the end of the Civil War, the alternative that confronted the nation, writes Du Bois, was not between full and restricted Negro suffrage, else every sensible man, black and white, would easily have chosen the latter. It was rather a choice between suffrage and slavery, after endless blood and gold had flowed to sweep human bondage away. Not a single Southern legislature stood ready to admit a Negro under any conditions to the polls. Not a single Southern legislature believed free Negro labor was possible without a system of restrictions that took all its freedom away. There was scarcely a white man in the South who did not honestly regard emancipation as a crime and its practical nullification as a duty. In such a situation, the granting of the ballot to the black man was a necessity, the very least a guilty nation could grant a wronged race, and the only method of compelling the South to accept the results of the war. It's in his work in this historical style that Du Bois seems to me most politically persuasive. But it could lead him back into puzzling corners of retreat, 19th century corners, one might say, even in the 20th century. His Harvard valedictorian address on the subject of Jefferson Davis proposed that Davis might be understood and appreciated as an epitome of Teutonic virtue with its worship of the strong man. The error was only to admire this spirit excessively, not make appropriate allowance for the spirit of submissive man, which Du Bois identifies with the character of black folk. During slavery, and as a consequence of it perhaps, but also, he seems to suggest, before and after slavery. Now, this is an instance of 19th century organicist thinking about society, very much in line with ideas of complementarity, opposing and mutually fulfilling roles that are sometimes assigned to whole peoples, as Du Bois did and Carlyle before him, and sometimes to epochs, as when Matthew Arnold spoke of the Renaissance as an epoch of expansion and the positivist 19th century as an epoch of concentration. By identifying black people with the nature of submissive man, that's not to make too much out of it, because this is Du Bois at the age of 21 or so, but the young Du Bois did not mean to endorse an attitude of passive obedience and the charitable allowance of injury. He was interested rather in an idea of virtue, of duty that would issue in acts of collective care and not chiefly in the exploits of war. But characterization of whole races is a tendency that certainly persists in his work beyond his college years, as when he speaks of his willingness, for example, to accept help from the representatives of the best white Southern opinion. Quote, "I should be the last to withhold sympathy from the white South in its efforts to solve its intricate social problems. I freely acknowledge that it's possible, and sometimes best, that a partially undeveloped people should be ruled by the best of their stronger and better neighbors for their own good, until such time as they can start and fight the world's battles alone." This is very similar to the kind of thinking you get in that, phase of the liberalism of John Stuart Mill, where, for example, in On Liberty, he says that the conditions of liberty he's laying out as necessary to a free society do not apply to people in their nonage, and he means British India, for example. Du Bois here, I think pretty unmistakably, and he is to some significant extent a utilitarian in his social thinking. Du Bois is following that pattern and saying that it is just as it might be right for the talented 10th among black people to guide the others, so for the white people too, so perhaps for everyone. The white aristocracy, to the extent that they're educated and not just creatures of privilege, should be the ones given charge of the poor whites. He singles out for qualified admiration the specialization of individual character, as of races too, that can assist success, after all. Saying of Booker T. Washington, "It's as though nature must needs make men narrow in order to give them force." And he means that as praise of Washington. Du Bois' own standard of virtue, and I think in the largest sense, this is how he would want to be taken, was laid out in his essay, The Talented 10th, where manhood and chastity and aspiration are opposed to servility and lewdness and apathy. The goal, as he puts it, is not to make men carpenters, but to make carpenters men. It's a kind of phrase that you get in the writings of the young Karl Marx, of the 1844 manuscripts, for example, which Du Bois could not have read. And yet he concedes that the educated who have once had the experience of thinking for themselves are by that fact destined to live with a kind of double consciousness as ironists, gifted or burdened by their condition. Education, which may save people for the productive life of reform, also kills their capacity for the usual satisfactions of society. And there's this telling passage on that predicament of education in the chapter of the Souls of Black Folk called Of the Coming of John. John, remember there are two of them, one white, one black. This is the black one, has been embraced by his younger sister on his return home. John, she said, does it make everyone unhappy when they study and learn lots of things? He paused and smiled. I'm afraid it does, he said. And John, are you glad you studied? Yes, came the answer, slowly but positively. She watched the flickering lights upon the sea and said thoughtfully, I wish I was unhappy. And putting both arms about his neck, I think I am a little, John. It's an extraordinary passage, a really great passage. Maybe we can talk about it presently. The question might linger for a reader of Du Bois. He's that intellectual, that encyclopedic, that erudite, and that trusting of the rewards as well as the pains of education. Well then, but what are the enjoyments of life for people who are without such learning or similar other cultural resources to take them out of themselves? Du Bois' quiet and intermittent but very characteristic humor gives us this answer in the chapter A New England Boy, From Dusk of Dawn. He's talking about his hometown of Great Barrington, Massachusetts. In the whole town, colored and white, there was not much crime. The one excess was drunkenness, and there my mother quietly took a firm stand. I was never to enter a liquor saloon. I never did. I donned a Murphy blue ribbon, non-drinker. And yet perhaps as I now see, the one solace that this pleasant but spiritually rather drab little town had against the monotony of life was liquor, and rich and poor got drunk more or less regularly. I have seen one of the mill owners staggering home, and my very respectable uncle used to come home now and then walking exceedingly straight. Only those of us who've been drunk know what that means. I'm going to shorten this a little. Let me offer a generalization which will seem hardly surprising and not argumentative enough to warrant being called a thesis, and that is that Du Bois's insights were incomparably greater than any program he was able to ally himself with or eventually to back. To take in the force of the self-contradiction in him, I think one has to come back to his view of the state, the rational, if partial, trust that he invested in a bureaucracy as willy-nilly the vehicle for the advance of social enlightenment, and the state as providing subsidy for the scientific investigations launched by sociology. There was real disappointment from him at the failure to get adequate funding at Atlanta University, though he had many connections with people in the foundations and close to government. The movement for organized opposition to discrimination in the building of a consumer league suffered a comparable setback from the absence of power in black unions and corporations. So, as I was saying earlier, late as it came and perverse in its lateness, his conversion to communism in this sense followed the logic of his thinking throughout. Who might we go to for a sociological counterpoint to Du Bois and maybe seek from such a character some counterstatement? My choice here would be the American sociologist, radical sociologist of the 1950s, C. Wright Mills. In a vein that very strikingly recalls the review by Du Bois of complacent histories of Reconstruction in his essay, of 1935, The Propaganda of History, an extraordinary essay where his mastery of the historical materials shows almost incidentally. Mills, for his part, spoke of the faith invested by his generation in social science among academic liberals, which led them to acquiesce in an idea of benevolent state control. The discussion occurs in one of Mills's later polemical writings, The Sociological Imagination, 1959. It would be interesting to know if Du Bois read that book, and if so, what he made of its argument. In a chapter on the bureaucratic ethos, Mills wrote, and I'm quoting now from that book, quote, "Among the slogans used by a variety of schools of social science, none is so frequent as, quote, 'The purpose of social science is the prediction and control of human behavior.' Nowadays, in some circles, we also hear much about human engineering, an undefined phrase often mistaken for a clear and obvious goal. It is believed to be clear and obvious because it rests upon an unquestioned analogy between the mastery of nature and the mastery of society." How much complicity was there in the intellect of Du Bois in that merging of the mastery of nature and the mastery of society? I think his best intellectual and imaginative instincts revolted from it, but a great deal of his training and his social science optimism went that way. Going on with the quotation now from Mills, "The slogans of the human engineers serve to carry the bureaucratic ethos beyond the actual use of this style of thought and method of inquiry. To use these slogans as a statement of what one is about is to accept a bureaucratic role even when one is not enacting it. This role, in short, is very often assumed on an as-if basis, assuming the technocratic view." And by the way, reminds me, I found Du Bois using the word technocratic as a pejorative word with exactly our meaning for it in the 1920s. That must be one of the earliest sharply critical, ironic uses of the word that there is in the English language. And again, the tension in the man, that it militates against the sort of bureaucratic faith he espoused elsewhere. Anyway, it's brought to mind by Mill's use of the phrase in 1959. Assuming the technocratic view, and as a social scientist trying to act upon it, is to act as if one were indeed a human engineer. To act in this as if I were a human engineer manner might be merely amusing in a society in which human reason were widely and democratically installed, but the United States is not such a society. Let me go to a final passage to bring out what I think could be the deepest imaginable but deserved resonance for Du Bois's touchstone idea of the double consciousness. It comes from a passage called Harding and Social Equality of December 1921. Of course, there's some hope, some faith from Harding who it was who pardoned Eugene Debs. Harding is a Republican. And here's a case where Du Bois, again, is pressing and pressing as he pressed ex-President Hayes, as he would press even Coolidge. So in this essay he writes, "For 50 years, the Southern white man has said to the Negro, 'Do you mean to say that you consider yourself fit to associate with white people?' And the Negro has answered, but the question which he answered was not the one asked, but rather the other totally different question. 'Do you mean to say that you want to force your friendship and company on persons who do not want them?' The answer to this is obviously an emphatic no. But when the Negro said no, he knew that he was not answering the question the white man intended to ask, and the white man knew that the Negro knew this, and that he himself had purposely asked a question of double and unreconcilable meaning when he said, 'Do you want social equality, social sameness, social parity, undesired and enforced, or just to be treated as a human being?' The act of radical redescription by which Du Bois took hold of the phrase, the Negro problem, with its inevitable mixture of veiled reproach and a patronizing helpfulness, and turned it on its head and made it face both ways by saying, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. That seems to me, too, at the heart of how we are meant to interpret the idea of double consciousness. It is a consequence not of one or the other form of being, but of the line itself. Not the Negro problem, then, but the color line, the very thing that creates the unhappy insight given to double consciousness, is what we are asked to work on by Du Bois in his phase as historian, in his phase as imaginative recounter of his own life, much more than in his capacity as sociologist. All my life, he says in a very humane passage of Dusk of Dawn, all my life I've had continually to haul my soul back and say, all white folk are not scoundrels nor murderers. They are, even as I am, painfully human. Well, the quality of the double consciousness may be only to let him feel you know it better than they do, and behind that lies, at least in the distance, a possibility of laughter, and I'll be talking about that in the third and final lecture tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for this beautifully meditative lecture on a no less beautifully meditative, illuminating figure. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that I'd perfectly happily have another hour of that right now. It was so mesmerizing. The floor is open for questions. Matt has the microphone.
I realized this was the opposite. If anyone was here from the previous lecture, I see some who were. That was so concentrated and this was so sprawling, so my apologies for the contrast, but there we are.
Yeah, Brother David, for many of us, this is such a special moment to have, in my opinion, one of the last of the great humanist intellectuals in the world of scholarship and letters reflecting on this towering public intellectual. I would add just to your piece in London Review of Books, Act 1, Scene 1, best thing written on Donald Trump as of this moment, but that's just a footnote. But about Du Bois, is it the case that Du Bois in some ways is more European and American in the sense, you invoke Weber, but as a disciple of Goethe, there's a sense in which his relation to Simmel might be more intimate in the relation of Bourne in that sense, as someone who can go in the academy, out of the academy, over against the academy, writes the poetic prose, but also a rigorous sociological work, philosophy of money, and so forth. And if that's the case, and it's linked to the Victorians, because Victorians fell in love with the Germans, Carlyle and others, and projected that sense that if you really want to get at the deeper frequencies of modernity, you go German. You know, it's Beethoven, it's Schleiermacher, it's Hegel, it's Feuerbach, and so forth.
And Wagner.
And
which he
absolutely, for Du Bois, very much Wagner. But what do you make of the European connection, which doesn't downplay the brilliance of your American connections, but of the European connections for Du Bois, given that?
Nobody, a copy of Dusk of Dawn? If nobody does, I won't read out a bit. But I think that's right, and it's an inspired comparison with Simmel, a writer I remember reading with similar sensations to what I have from Du Bois, but I haven't read enough of him to profit from the comparison adequately. I obviously went to Bourne for the World War I moment and to see Wright Mills for some resonance with Du Bois's experience of McCarthyism and the American conformity of that period, which made him finally in exile. So those are more obvious provocations for those American comparisons. I think you're right that you by saying it the way you did, Cornell, sent him right out of American studies, where I was trying to plant him again. It's hard to know what to make of that. As he says, his knowledge of Germany, he felt, made him know more deeply why the best in German culture had to be opposed even by war. And in Dusk of Dawn, those last sentences talk about his travels all around the world in 1938, 39, and 40, but they're peculiar, unsatisfactory bits of montage there, because you get the feeling of nothing so much as that Du Bois has seen all the sights and met all the people, and so his judgment must be pretty damn well qualified. But he says all that it amounts to is he knew that there was a coming crisis. Well, a lot of people knew that in 1940. You didn't need him to tell you that. So I think there too, there's a quality of reticence and a slight embarrassment about advertising in detail just how great his attachment to Europe and European things is. He stayed for how long in Germany? Was it 2 years, something like? He stayed in Germany for longer than he had to, and it's clear that not just from causes of American racism, he felt some real affinity between himself and the intellects he met there, and he went back in later life in order to reacquaint himself with the language and culture. So, yeah, high culture and the doctrine of the good of inculcating on oneself the experience of high culture, that's a major element in Bourne, and in a sense estranges him not just from the poorer and less educated of black folk, but from American society as such. It isn't, Henry James and T.S. Eliot a generation later are telling Americans, you have to work to inherit the great tradition of culture and it comes from Europe. But it isn't really until universities in this country profit from the emigre scholars coming out of Germany and elsewhere in the 30s and 40s. It isn't until that great moment of American education that you and I are lucky to have been part of, 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. It isn't until then that American emulation of Europe becomes a major chord in American culture. It's gone now, I think, and it's a terrible loss. But Du Bois was, untimely, and also, out of place in the issues he was prepared to confront in talking about very directly his debt to the classical traditions of Europe and Germany, especially. I'm guessing that may come out more in his fiction, which I don't know well enough to talk about.
Great lecture, I loved it. Always say, teach Du Bois to my students that he's basically 19th century, turn of the century, 20th century German intellectual. But so I think that's right. In some commentary on Du Bois, like in Robert Gooding Williams' book *In the Shadow of Du Bois*, he plays up a dimension of what you're playing up here as well, which is Du Bois as a conception of leadership as rule, that he tends to think like a state, that even when he's appealing directly, say, to black people and so on, and trying to encourage them to do things. And I'm always trying to read, find other moments on him that kind of soften that picture. And so I wanted to just get your reflections a little about one place. You brought up Dusk of Dawn a fair bit. And there's a picture there of black people having to embody the form of life that needs to be brought into being, in terms of like black cooperatives, as you mentioned, trying to, in some ways, model the form of life that Du Bois hopes will eventually prevail.
Some of them modeling it for others, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
And in that picture, it's still true that there's a picture of a strong, intelligent leadership, educated leadership in that that process. But he also tends to emphasize, it is in the Talented stuff, but it's also in the 40s stuff as well, a picture of that leadership as a matter of example itself, as a matter of modeling a certain way of being, and also doing that through, not by dictating commands, but by character, by sacrifice, by a sense of service. So that picture is there as well, and I just wondered if you see that as just pulling the other direction, or does that make you want to see at least that later Du Bois as maybe not quite as attached to a conception of leadership as rooted in technocratic forms of ruling and thought.
Yeah, well, he'll speak about its necessity in both idioms and talk about the state and talk about it, as it were, from the roots leadership of those who happen to be talented and have relative privilege, both for white and black society. And your question is a kind of corrective to an emphasis I may have misplaced. I did not mean to criticize or dissociate myself from Du Bois's belief that the more talented in any social group are an example that helps raise the group. That has to, you can even say that for the American middle class or the American political class. What are we so worried about now, except that such an array of bad examples are being set? I mean, extraordinarily bad examples. And so, I mean, I think he's simply intelligent about that. He's not patronizing. He's an unembarrassed elitist, and there are uses of an elite that don't militate against equality, that don't ultimately work against equality. So, I think not only is he more flexible than I may have just presented him, that is to say, if there seemed to be a conflation in my argument between his investment in the idea of the state, bureaucratic mechanisms, and so on, and his idea of leadership of the talented. Not only is he's less abstractionist altogether, but I think he's speaking an honest truth that enlightened men and women of mind at the end of the 19th century agreed on, and that we of the early 21st have a harder time agreeing on for complex reasons. But I'm on his side in that, so thank you for the modification, and it's going to change the way I think weigh these details in writing it. Did I answer your question? Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, David. To bolster Cornell's point just a little, there is this tradition in the 19th century, of course, of viewing Germany as a kind of pinnacle of intellectual education. People like Tickner and others here at Harvard seeing it as necessary for the real intellectual finish. And I can recall Du Bois saying that one of his experiences here was reading the Critique of Pure Reason in George Santayana's attic study.
He speaks of that. Yeah.
With Santayana.
Tutorial.
In German.
Can you just imagine
quite
that.
Remarkable.
Right.
The question I had was, have you found any parallels in Du Bois's writings with those who write about the American labor movement, people like John L. Lewis or Rosa Schneiderman or others who, from a more narrow compass, but nevertheless are writing about a different kind of double consciousness where it's management versus labor, it's the working people versus the people who own?
Yeah, that's not a literature I'm well read in at all. That is to say, the left-wing literature of the labor movement itself, as opposed to fiction about it or documentary films and so on. But I think the contest there is different in kind. It's not such as to promote a double consciousness. That is just straightforward agonistic contest. The bosses want to keep more money. They have scabs. They have their agents working against you. It simply is the most like a war that you can make it, within the necessities of wanting to win it and knowing that they have the weapons and sometimes may have the state on their side. So, I mean, I guess I'm giving away a certain contesting spirit that comes from having emerged from a left-wing family, my father being a labor lawyer. But the attitude is different. The which side are you on, boys? Attitude has to be different from what would yield the double consciousness. The double consciousness comes from misery and thought about misery, or from a complex life of reflection. That's the both gift and pain part of it. The idea is that it's overwhelmingly pain, but it need not be. That's what makes that passage in Du Bois, I think, so fascinating and ambiguous. It's half Whitman, half Frederick Douglass's narrative of his time in slavery. Excuse me. Is there? Jim, I don't think. I think they're different things. If I seem to speak as a total pacifist in the sense of not wanting contest over anything, I misrepresented my views. I'm against war, all the big wars except the two that everybody makes allowances for and wants to generalize from, the Civil War and the Second World War. But contest against those who don't want to give up their privilege, I think, is a usual pattern of society among people fighting for relative equality against those who don't want to give up privilege.
Thank you for your talk. I'm not clear. There was a statement you made early on about double consciousness being pleasurable, or words to that effect, I thought, or being a rich state in which to be.
Richer, wider, more, just more to be desired than single consciousness. Yeah.
I'm wondering.
Not how Du Bois means it, but what his words open up, and what his use of the word gift might imply about that. I don't mean that's how he immediately uses it in the context, or that that's what the meaning of the veil is.
Or that when you say those things about it, you're not talking necessarily about what he's talking about.
Well, it's interesting. What he's talking about is both the trap that Frederick Douglass, describes in his versions of his narrative, but it's also the self-constructed situation of mental speculation and of understanding of a complexity of things that most people don't have, that Ellison pictures in the preface, that prefatory passage where he's living in the basement room of Invisible Man. He knows what his invisibility is like. He also knows what high visibility is. He is able to see himself as other people see him in a way that's not possible to his white antagonist or to his less, aesthetically trained black contemporaries. So there's that given, as it were, aesthetic complexity to the condition. And all I meant to say is that Du Bois's characterization of it, and it's just in 2 or 3 sentences, isn't it? Allows for both possibilities. He's immediately concerned with the part of it that has to do with misery and pain to the black person who can't live without this for a moment. But the interest even in laughter that you get from, I think it's in Du Bois too, but that Ellison spells out in his great essay, An Extravagance of Laughter, has to do with existing on both sides of the veil. And seeing more aspects, as it were, being by the fact of this compulsion and even suffering, being able to see society in a way that brings out its deceptions, as ordinary people who belong to what Mill called the satisfied classes. Ordinary people don't see it. You're not just seeing the wrongs, you're also seeing the compromises, the dealings, what people are getting out of each other. There's that possibility of perception that is heightened. And I'm pulling Ellison together with Du Bois here, but I think that implication is there in Du Bois. Du Bois thinks he is more, he does not think too little of himself, ever. But he thinks he is not only more learned, more cultured, more capacious in his knowledge, and more wise, and more unselfish than most people. And he's certainly right about the last thing, and about most of them. But he also thinks he's more perceptive. And he believes that the perceptiveness has happened as a development out of one of the possibilities of living as a black person not too miserably in American society. And I think it's not clear to him whether that's possible for any white person.
So, I wonder if he realizes he's actually then writing about triple consciousness.
Okay.
He's actually talking about what, like, in other words, double consciousness is, I don't know about for most black people, but I think for anyone who knows what it means for your mother to do the telephone voice. Okay, nobody knows what that means here. I think that...
Now we both have a secret because I said the thing about being drunk, so never mind. We shouldn't do this coat trailing.
I think that like it's one thing to be bilingual, but it's another thing to be a translator.
Uh-huh.
And so, like, if you're saying double consciousness, but then actually like I kind of dig this double consciousness, or I use it or manipulate it, that's not double consciousness. That's triple consciousness.
Okay.
That's I know this side, I know this side, and I know how to work the middle. And
but it's not so how to work it. But it's not what I'm speaking of. If there's anything to it, doesn't have to do with manipulation and gaining leverage. It has to do with just seeing.
Or even just seeing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, or even just seeing. Just
right.
like, any kind of, anything where any kind of meta consciousness about those states, I guess is what I'm, that's, and it just thinking about it, I'm like, no, that doesn't seem like fun or a good place to be. Like if you say, I'm nearly dead and I've met people of my class just enough times to count on two hands, white people of my class just enough to count on two hands. That's not a great place to be.
Right. Okay. I mean, does the passage from Whitman that I quoted about being both in and out of the game have any resonance for you with what you think Du Bois might mean?
That's so interesting because when I was trying to think, what would double consciousness be for a white male? My first thought was that, well, what most people would probably say is, well, being a closeted gay one. But then I said, well, no, there are closeted black gay people. So what would it be then?
But you can't be. But the double consciousness, by the nature of it, the way he describes it, it's got to be visible. It's not. And closeted means it's not. Unless you think everybody has, a nose for who's gay, but not everybody does or even thinks about it. Whereas somebody black or with dark-colored skin, or with some obvious difference printed on them, which is creating this kind, and nowhere so much as for African Americans in America. You know that's being seen about you all the time, and then you're apt to interpret, and probably right to interpret, almost every interaction as in some way tinged with it.
Or possibly so.
Or possibly so, and even the doubt element creates this. That's why I use the word apprehensiveness about him. But I can't do better than I've done. I'm trying to express it as not to subtract the pain or misery that he loads it with, because that's inevitable. But he didn't feel that all the time himself. He felt regret, but he also felt, I think, it comes out most of all in his the travel chapters, both of the Black Belt and being a school teacher in Tennessee, and some of his little digressions elsewhere in other essays on New England, that he, it's as if he's already factored in the immediate reaction that comes from the color of his skin, and he's standing back. That's why I use the Whitman quotation, and there's something in him that's observing what's happening to him. Now, when that's being done in a condition of misery, I don't have a job, and this is preventing me from having a job, or I would like to say hello to this man or woman, but he or she is white, and I can't do it. That's bad. But when you're just looking at a transaction or something that's happening to you with you're able to figure it in, and you're not in a state of uncertainty that is a, unpleasant condition of life that has to be submitted to. I think he's saying that exists. That's why he says that's why he uses the word gift, and it's what made me. I'm not the first. I found it in a footnote somewhere, in proximity to Du Bois, closer to Thoreau. But I think that's why the uncertain, palpable rest, that curiosity, an element of curiosity, of being, I'll say it again, estranged, but not necessarily, therefore, alienated, and the realism of that posture of estrangement. That I think is one of the things he wants to set out as a possibility.
Thank you.
So, unless I just dreamed it, you put on the threshold of this lecture the story about Du Bois not recognizing that women might be different.
I don't even know what to make of it. Yeah.
Well, but
Yeah. He means physically.
yeah, no, because I just wanted to know if there's something more thoughts that you have about it than you said, because, I mean, you've given us what this sense of this kind of capacious mind with these many events going on.
But also huge inhibition.
Okay,
And, yeah, that's part of it too. Yeah.
Huge inhibition, but
Yeah.
what it somehow seems that what you've described can't be accounted for by Puritanism. That is, could it be
okay.
accounted for by something like a kind of unbelievable capacity to not see, or to see any kind of apprehension of difference as an act of cruelty, an assumption of difference as an act of cruelty to such an extent that you could have made a mistake?
Maybe. I maybe shouldn't have begun with that. I only, or even used it. I wanted to justify the word strange and estrangement. Okay, and the other phrases I quoted from him about where he used the word literally in a rather inexact, reckless way that's not characteristic of him, that he was literally frightened into marriage. You think it's going to be explained that it's a shotgun marriage or something, but he doesn't mean that, but it's not clear what he means. So I think, Elaine, it's consistent with an unexamined inhibition, also with an unexamined abstraction that goes with tenderness towards people,
Yeah.
and maybe a most unusual, anomalous way of conceiving of other people as people. There's no doubt about his humaneness,
Yeah.
no doubt for me. He never speaks of the sacrifice of some group of people or some subset of people as inevitable. Nobody's expendable for him. Not that pity and tender care is his dominant emotion, but there's something, I'll just come back to it, something anomalous in the humanism of the man, and you're suggesting maybe that it changes even the sensational ways in which he was able to respond to people. But I think for most people, I do think it's almost universal. No matter how Puritan you are, if your mother doesn't let you see her except fully dressed, you're curious about why that is, a little bit. There's people, who say, I've never had running water, known what it was till I was 17. But I've never encountered another human being who had normal development in so many respects, who actually would say with apparent literal truth that he had no idea of the physical difference between men and women until he was 17. So,
Thank you so much. I would like to ask a question with regard to you mentioning Gandhi at some point in your talk. And I'm an Africanist, so when you said you were thinking about possible interlocutors for Du Bois, I just wondered, what about African intellectuals or academics who in their writing speak to Du Bois quite obviously? I mean, someone like Saul Plaatje or Samuel Mukai in South Africa, a sociologist himself, Aimé Césaire. So people who actually do speak to him on certain issues and are preoccupied, with in South Africa with the native question. That would kind of open up maybe different readings. So I wondered if your sense of it, what would that do for you if you follow that?
It would educate me. You're out of my depth. There's some hollow spots. But I was determined, and maybe my own parochialism shows here, to give him American interlocutors, even though, as Cornel West said, and as others have been bringing out, Jim Engel too, I mean, there's something not merely American about him, and it's far from my intention to want to emphasize his national heroic stature as the main interesting thing about him. He did, I think, I haven't counted up, but I think he did dedicate the vast preponderance of his writing to American subjects, even though he ended living in Africa, and his prophetic relationship to anti-colonialism and decolonization makes him of interest to those writers. But the material he worked with was the material of the American 19th and early 20th century, lynchings, Reconstruction, Civil War. Yeah.
David, thank you for a mesmerizing
Thank you.
view.
Thank you.